Welcome to this discussion on why authoritarian leaders throughout history have loved religion, not just as a matter of personal belief, but as a tool for power. This isn't about private faith or personal spirituality. This is about control, obedience, and why religion and authoritarian systems so often walk hand in hand through history. Authoritarians want one thing above all: stability under their rule. That means obedience, unity, and an absence of rebellion. But how do you convince millions of people to accept control without constant force? Fear works for a while, but fear alone breeds resentment. You need something deeper, something that shapes not just behavior, but thought itself. Religion provides that in a way almost nothing else can. When a leader allies with religion, authority becomes more than political, it becomes sacred. Orders stop being suggestions from a human and start sounding like commands from heaven. Disobeying the ruler becomes more than breaking a law, it becomes defying the divine. That shift is enormous because it moves control from the outside to the inside. People no longer obey just because they fear punishment. They obey because they believe it is morally right, even necessary for their salvation. That's why authoritarian regimes across history have leaned on religious authority. It doesn't just enforce loyalty, it sanctifies it. Look at ancient empires. Egyptian pharaohs ruled as living gods. Their word wasn't just law, it was cosmic order. This wasn't ego, it was strategy. If people think your authority is eternal and unquestionable, they will endure hardship without revolt. The same pattern appears in China's mandate of heaven, in Rome where emperors became divine, and later in European monarchies under the doctrine of the divine right of kings. In each case, religion wasn't a side note, it was the foundation of political control. Why does this work so well? Because religion taps into psychological needs that every human shares. We crave certainty in an uncertain world. We fear death. We want belonging and purpose. Religion answers all of these with authority that claims to come from beyond human reach. Authoritarians exploit this by positioning themselves as guardians of that authority. When the ruler stands between you and chaos, between you and eternal punishment, obedience feels less like submission and more like survival. Modern dictators do this too. Think about regimes that present their leaders as messianic figures chosen by destiny, blessed by heaven. Even in officially secular states, the structure often mimics religion: rituals, sacred texts, heroic myths. Totalitarian systems like Stalinism or North Korean Juche replace gods with leaders but keep the same psychological machinery: devotion, ritual, punishment for heresy. It's not coincidence, it's human psychology harnessed for power. Another reason authoritarians love religion is that it trains people for obedience before politics even enters the picture. Most religions teach submission to authority as a virtue, whether that authority is divine, clerical, or parental. Questioning is framed as rebellion. Doubt is labeled weakness or sin. These patterns shape minds long before adulthood, making populations easier to govern through hierarchy. When you're taught from childhood that virtue means obedience, a strong leader doesn't feel oppressive, it feels natural. Ritual plays a big role here too. Authoritarians and religions both understand the power of repetition. Stand up, kneel down, recite the words, sing the anthem. Whether it's in a temple or a rally, the effect is the same. Individuality dissolves into the group. Neuroscience shows that synchronized activity, chanting, marching, singing, creates feelings of unity and trust. That trust can be redirected toward whoever claims leadership. It's not magic, it's conditioning. And once conditioned, people often mistake it for conviction. Fear is another shared tool. Religion uses eternal stakes, heaven or hell. Authoritarians use temporal ones: prison, exile, death. Together, these fears create a double cage: punishment in this life and torment in the next. That combination has silenced countless voices through history. Why risk rebellion if the price is not just execution but damnation? This is why oppressive regimes often promote conservative, religious interpretations. They want a faith that warns, obey your ruler. Not all religions teach this, but many texts can be interpreted that way, and authoritarians make sure those interpretations dominate. Let's look at some historical examples. In Franco's Spain, Catholicism became a tool for political control. In Iran, after 1979, religion became the spine of a theocratic state. In Russia today, the Orthodox Church often echoes state propaganda, blessing wars and silencing dissent. These are not accidents. They are alliances of convenience. The state protects the church legitimizes the state, and the price is paid by ordinary people whose freedom is sacrificed for this unholy partnership. But why does this matter today? Because the pattern hasn't gone away. Around the world, leaders still use religion to consolidate power. They frame themselves as defenders of faith, even when their policies betray its ethical core. They know faith can unite, and unity under their control is what they want most. And in times of crisis, economic collapse, war, pandemics, these tactics work even better. Fear drives people towards certainty, and religion offers certainty in abundance. The leader who wraps himself in that certainty becomes untouchable. Yet this alliance is fragile in one sense. It depends on ignorance. It thrives when people don't see the mechanism behind it. When you recognize that faith is being used as a tool, the spell weakens. That's why authoritarian systems often fear education, free speech, and open debate. They know that once people start asking who benefits from this belief, the game is over. Transparency is poison to control. The truth is, religion and authoritarianism share a common language: obedience, loyalty, destiny, fear. And when those languages merge, they create systems that feel eternal, even though they're built by human hands. Breaking that illusion takes courage, but it begins with understanding the pattern. Because once you see the chain, you can choose whether to wear it. And that choice, the ability to question, to doubt, to refuse blind obedience, is the greatest threat to any system built on control. That's why this conversation matters, because every time someone understands why authoritarians love religion, the alliance between power and superstition grows weaker, and the future becomes a little freer. One of the key reasons religion fits so perfectly into authoritarian systems is the way it trains minds for absolute trust. Most faith traditions introduce ideas that cannot be verified: miracles, divine plans, eternal life. Accepting these requires faith, which means believing without evidence. Now, once someone accepts that framework, they've learned to surrender critical thinking in certain areas. This isn't because people are weak or unintelligent. It's because they were taught that doubt is dangerous, even sinful. When obedience is tied to morality and salvation, questioning feels like betrayal. Authoritarian rulers love this because it creates a population already conditioned to follow authority without demanding proof. Psychologists have studied this phenomenon for decades. Stanley Milgram's famous obedience experiment showed that ordinary people will inflict harm on others if an authority figure tells them to. The shocking part wasn't just that they obeyed, it was how easily they did so. The lesson is clear: when authority feels legitimate, people comply, even against their own conscience. Religion magnifies this effect by giving authority a sacred aura. If you've been taught your whole life to trust the priest, the imam, the pastor, and those figures support the ruler, then obeying the ruler feels like obeying God. And when morality and loyalty fuse, questioning power becomes not just risky, it becomes sinful. Now think about propaganda. Every authoritarian regime needs to control the narrative. Religion makes that easier because it already operates on narrative. Grand stories about origins, destiny, good versus evil. These stories shape identity and emotion far more than facts ever could. Leaders know this. That's why they frame political struggles in religious terms. Wars become holy wars. Opponents become enemies of God. Policies become divine missions. This framing activates deep psychological triggers: tribal loyalty, fear of outsiders, willingness to sacrifice for a greater cause. The result is a population ready to march, fight, or even die, not for a political agenda, but for what they think is eternal truth. Take the Crusades as an example. Were they about faith or power? Both, but power hid behind faith. Kings and popes promised heavenly rewards for those who fought, turning brutal wars into sacred duties. That wasn't unique to the Middle Ages. In modern times, leaders still use the same script. Look at how some regimes present conflicts as battles for the soul of the nation, blessed by divine will. That language isn't accidental. It's a strategy to transform obedience into virtue. Authoritarians also exploit religion's control of private life. Unlike secular law, which governs actions, religion often claims authority over thoughts, desires, and conscience. That level of control is priceless for a dictator because it means surveillance isn't just external, it's internalized. People police themselves, fearing not just the state, but an all-seeing deity. You don't need cameras on every street corner when you've convinced people that God watches even their thoughts. That's totalitarianism perfected. Economic factors play a role too. Authoritarians often rise in times of crisis, economic collapse, war, social upheaval. During these times, fear skyrockets and people crave stability. Religion offers ready-made answers. Suffering has purpose. Order is divine. Obedience brings peace. Leaders amplify this message because it serves their goal: stop the chaos by rallying under one banner, faith and state united. This formula has worked from ancient Egypt to 20th century fascism. It works because fear and uncertainty push people towards certainty, even if that certainty is an illusion. Now let's talk about corruption. One might expect religion to restrain corrupt rulers, but history shows the opposite. When a regime controls religious institutions or works hand in hand with them, faith becomes a shield against criticism. Speak out against the leader and you're accused of attacking God's chosen authority. In some cases, dissenters are branded heretics or traitors, silencing opposition without a single soldier lifting a weapon. This isn't a hypothetical. It happened in Franco's Spain, where the church endorsed authoritarian policies, branding rebels as godless. It happens today in countries where clergy preach loyalty to the state as a moral duty. In these systems, morality itself becomes a weapon, defined not by justice or compassion, but by obedience. There's another layer that's often overlooked: gender and family. Authoritarian ideologies love rigid hierarchies, and so does traditional religion. Patriarchal structures, father at the top, then mother, then children, mirror authoritarian governance. By enforcing obedience in the home, these systems prepare people for obedience in society. The father becomes the little monarch, the priest echoes that model, and the ruler stands as the ultimate patriarch. Control flows downward like a chain, from heaven to throne to household. Break that chain, and you're not just challenging politics, you're defying the cosmic order. This framing makes rebellion feel unnatural, even blasphemous. When you step back, you see the pattern. Religion doesn't just support authoritarian power, it provides the blueprint for it. Both systems rely on hierarchy, obedience, ritual, fear, and myth. Both claim exclusive truth. Both punish dissent. Together, they form a cage so complete that many people never realize they're inside it. And yet, history also shows cracks in this alliance. The Enlightenment challenged the idea that divine authority legitimizes political power. Democratic revolutions pushed for secular states where laws come from people, not gods. But even now, in the 21st century, the old partnership resurfaces whenever fear rises and freedoms feel fragile. That's why understanding this pattern matters. Because when you see how the strings are pulled, you're harder to control. When we look at the 20th century, it becomes clear that authoritarian leaders didn't just tolerate religion, they actively courted it, even in regimes that claimed to be secular. Take Nazi Germany. The Nazi ideology wasn't overtly religious, but Hitler understood the power of religious symbolism and language. He used Christian imagery, referred to divine providence in his speeches, and framed his mission as a struggle between good and evil. Many churches, particularly those that valued order and hierarchy, cooperated. They saw the regime as a bulwark against communism, which was perceived as godless. The result was an unspoken deal: support the state, and the state protects your influence. Millions paid the price for that alliance. Another striking example is fascist Italy. Mussolini wasn't a devout man, but he signed the Lateran Treaty with the Vatican in 1929, granting the church privileges in exchange for political legitimacy. Suddenly, sermons aligned with state propaganda. Priests preached loyalty to the Duce as a patriotic and spiritual duty. The cross and the fascist emblem appeared side by side. This was no accident. It was a deliberate merging of faith and nationalism, engineered to make obedience feel sacred. Moved to Spain under Franco. After the Civil War, his regime leaned heavily on Catholic identity. Schools taught religious doctrine alongside political ideology. Public life was saturated with religious symbolism. Dissent wasn't just rebellion against a dictator, it was rebellion against God. This created a psychological double bind: oppose tyranny and risk eternal damnation. Few tools of control are more effective than that. Even in the modern world, we see echoes of this strategy. In Russia, the Orthodox Church has become an arm of state influence. It blesses military actions, promotes traditional values that align with political goals, and frames loyalty to the state as moral duty. In some Middle Eastern countries, authoritarian regimes invoke religion to justify harsh laws and crush dissent, claiming divine mandate. The pattern is timeless. When power feels threatened, it seeks refuge in the sacred. Why does this alliance endure? Fear is the root. When societies face chaos, economic collapse, terrorism, cultural shifts, people crave certainty. Authoritarian leaders step in with promises of order. Religion amplifies that message, offering cosmic security. Together they create an irresistible narrative. Obey, and you will be safe. Not just in this life, but forever. Psychologists call this terror management theory. When mortality becomes salient, people cling harder to their worldviews and authorities that validate them. Leaders know this. They exploit crises to tighten the grip of faith and fear. Research on conformity reinforces this picture. Solomon Asch's experiments showed how group pressure can override individual judgment. People will agree with an obviously wrong answer if everyone else agrees. Now imagine that pressure multiplied by community, tradition, and divine authority. That's the weight of religion in an authoritarian system. It doesn't just pressure behavior, it defines reality. Once reality itself is framed by power, resistance becomes almost unthinkable. This brings us to education. Authoritarians rarely invest in critical thinking. They prefer indoctrination over inquiry. Religion serves this goal by promoting unquestioned truths. It teaches answers, not questions, and when people stop asking why, they become easy to govern. This isn't speculation, it's documented. In countries where religious and political authority intertwine, school curricula often prioritize dogma over science, obedience over reasoning. The result is generations trained to accept, not to doubt. That's not faith, that's social engineering. But the consequences of this alliance extend beyond politics. It shapes gender roles, cultural norms, even economic systems. Authoritarian leaders often push traditional values under the banner of religion because tradition stabilizes hierarchy. If women remain submissive, if family obeys father, if citizens respect ruler, the chain of command stays unbroken. Religion provides the moral justification for that chain. Break it, and the whole system trembles. That's why regimes invest so heavily in controlling morality. It's not about virtue, it's about power. And here's the critical insight. This strategy doesn't just silence dissent, it makes people defend their own subjugation. When obedience feels holy, tyranny feels righteous. People march, vote, and fight for the very system that limits their freedom, believing they're serving a higher good. That's the genius and the tragedy of this alliance. It turns control into devotion. As we move into the present day, the question is this pattern weakening or strengthening? In some places, secularization is eroding the grip of religion. In others, the backlash is fierce. Populist leaders often invoke faith to rally support, framing themselves as defenders of sacred traditions against modern threats. The slogans change, the rituals evolve, but the psychological mechanism remains the same. Fear plus faith equals control. The hidden costs of the alliance between authoritarianism and religion are not measured only in lost freedoms. They reach into the very fabric of societies and into the inner lives of individuals. When power uses faith as a weapon, something fundamental is stolen: the ability to think freely. And that theft doesn't feel like theft, it feels like virtue. That is the most dangerous part. People raised in this system believe they are choosing loyalty, when in truth, the choice has been shaped by years of conditioning. The social cost is enormous. Progress slows because new ideas are labeled dangerous. Science becomes suspect because it threatens dogma. Art, literature, and philosophy suffer because they thrive on questioning, and questioning is forbidden. Innovation dies in a climate where obedience matters more than curiosity. Economies stagnate when education becomes indoctrination. Nations that cling to this model often fall behind, trapped in cycles of poverty and repression, while those that separate power from faith flourish. History proves this over and over, yet the lesson is rarely learned because fear blinds people to alternatives. On a personal level, the damage is deeper. When morality is defined by obedience, people stop developing an inner sense of ethics. They follow rules not because they are just, but because they are commanded. That makes them vulnerable not just to religious authority, but to any authority that claims legitimacy. It produces citizens who conform even when their conscience whispers no, and when that happens, atrocities become possible, not because most people are evil, but because they surrender their moral compass to an external power. We've seen this before in regimes where ordinary men and women participated in horrors, convinced they were doing good. Why does authoritarianism need religion so badly? Because naked power is fragile. Force can compel action, but not loyalty. Fear can silence, but not inspire. Religion solves that problem by making obedience feel sacred. It wraps the fist of power in the glove of virtue. And why does religion often embrace authoritarianism? Because earthly power protects its influence. In return for loyalty, religion gains privilege, tax breaks, control of education, legal immunity. It's a bargain made in palaces and pulpits, paid for by the people who live under it. But here's the question that matters. Does the future belong to this alliance, or is it breaking down? There are signs of both. In some regions, authoritarian leaders still lean on religion to tighten their grip. They preach about morality while silencing critics. They hold rallies framed as spiritual revivals, and for now it works, because fear still works. But elsewhere, the pattern is collapsing. Education is spreading, technology is eroding the walls of information control. People are seeing that morality doesn't require obedience, and meaning doesn't require myth. That realization is slow, but it's growing. The irony is that this alliance survives best in darkness, not literal darkness, but ignorance. It thrives where people don't ask questions, where critical thought is seen as rebellion. The best antidote is light, the kind that comes from knowledge, from dialogue, from courage to doubt. Authoritarianism and religion share one ultimate fear: the individual who dares to think independently. Because that person cannot be controlled. They may obey laws out of reason, but not out of fear. They may respect tradition, but they will not worship it. That is the enemy of tyranny, the free mind. This is why conversations like this matter. They don't destroy faith. They don't mock belief. They simply reveal the machinery behind the illusion so that obedience becomes a choice, not a reflex. The alliance between power and superstition may look invincible, but history tells a different story. Empires that claim divine sanction have fallen. Thrones blessed by heaven have crumbled. What remains is the truth that no authority, sacred or secular, can own the human spirit forever. The next time you hear a leader invoke God to justify power, ask who benefits. The next time obedience is framed as virtue, ask who gains from your silence. Because freedom is never given, it's taken back. And that begins with a question. Does this serve truth, or does it serve control? That question has changed history before, it will change it again. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If this gave you a new perspective, share your thoughts in the comments. Let's keep the conversation alive. Because the more we understand, the harder it becomes for anyone to rule through fear disguised as faith.